Malcolm Vane didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to Silas Rourke's ranch office swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and Malcolm walked in like he already owned the place, because in his mind he already did. He dropped a single sheet of paper onto the desk, smooth as a man folding laundry, and smiled the kind of smile that never once touched his eyes. "Your water runs dry in 4 days," Malcolm said. "Sign that, and I'll let your cattle live." Silas didn't pick up the paper. He looked at the man, standing across from him, boots polished, coat pressed, not a single honest callus on either hand, and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear. Something worse than fear. The sick, grinding recognition that he was losing, and he didn't know how to stop it. If that had been you, sitting behind that desk, your life's work bleeding out, your men ready to walk, and your enemy standing there, grinning, what would you have done? Because what happened next at Blackstone Ridge changed everything. And it started with a woman nobody saw coming. Before we go further, if stories like this are what Shuko came here for, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss one. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning Silas Rourke signed the matrimonial agency contract, he was sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a ledger that hadn't balanced in 8 months. He wasn't a man who believed in asking for help. He'd built that into himself the same way you build a fence post, drive it deep, pack the dirt tight, don't let it wobble. For 20 years, he'd run Blackstone Ridge on stubbornness and early mornings and the understanding that the land didn't care how tired you were. The land just kept demanding. But stubbornness doesn't cook supper, and it doesn't stop good men from walking out the door. Most of its windows were dark. He'd lost 4 cowboys in the last 2 months. 3 of them had gone straight to Malcolm Vane's outfit, where the wages were higher and the cook actually showed up sober. The 4th had simply disappeared one night without leaving so much as a note. Silas had found his bunk stripped clean, like the man had never been there at all. The remaining hands were hanging on, but barely. He could see it in the way they moved slower than they used to, quieter at meals, glancing at each other with the look of men calculating how long they were willing to wait before making the same decision. The contract from the matrimonial agency was 2 pages long. He'd read it 3 times, told himself it was ridiculous each time, folded it up, put it in a drawer, taken it back out, and finally just signed the thing before he could talk himself out of it again. He wasn't looking for a wife the way other men looked for wives. He wasn't thinking about companionship or children, or any of the things the agency's pamphlet kept suggesting in careful, genteel language. He needs someone who could manage a household, someone with enough backbone to deal with rough men and harder winters, someone who wouldn't look at this place and burst into tears on the first cold morning. The agency's response had come back in 3 weeks. They'd found a match. A woman named Lenora Voss, 31 years old, from Pittsburgh. The letter described her as capable, self-sufficient, and experienced in domestic management. There was a small photograph included, blurry and slightly overexposed the way photographs always were. And he'd studied it longer than he intended to before setting it face down on the desk and going back to work. He told himself it didn't matter what she looked like. He told himself a lot of things that spring. The day the train was due, Silas drove the wagon into Caldwell without telling any of his men where he was going. He said he needed supplies, which was true. He just didn't mention the other part. The station was busy for a Thursday. A cattle car had arrived ahead of schedule, and the loading crew was already arguing about it near the south platform. Silas parked the wagon, tied the horses, and stood with his arms crossed near the main depot entrance, watching the train pull in with a sound like the world clearing its throat. People filed out in clusters. Families with children, a couple of businessmen carrying cases. 2 young cowboys who'd clearly been traveling since before dawn, wearing the look of men who'd slept against a window and weren't happy about it. Then she stepped out. He recognized her mostly by the carpetbag, the same battered leather bags she'd mentioned in her letter, patched at one corner with a piece of darker leather that didn't quite match the original. She was carrying it with her left hand and has a second, smaller bag on her right shoulder. And she stepped off that train onto the Wyoming platform and stopped. Not because she was lost, not because she was frightened. She stopped the way a person stops when they're taking stock. like a surveyor stepping onto a piece of ground for the first time and already beginning to measure it in their head. She wasn't dressed the way the agency's pamphlet had shown, with the neat bonnets and the pressed traveling coats on the women in the illustrations. Her clothes were practical, a dark blue dress that had been washed so many times it had softened past its original color, boots that had seen real use, a simple bonnet that was there for function rather than fashion, dark hair with a few strands already loose from the journey, eyes that, when they finally landed on him across the platform, were a shade of hazel he hadn't expected, not warm exactly, but sharp in a way that was almost startling. She walked toward him at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, and when she got within speaking distance, she looked him over the same way he was looking at her, openly, without apology. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "Not a question, Miss Voss." There was a pause that lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have. Neither of them quite knew what the right thing to say was. He'd thought about this moment on the drive into town and hadn't arrived at anything useful. "The wagon's this way," he finally said. "All right." That was the entirety of their first conversation. He'd been watching the platform the whole time without meaning to, which is how he noticed the 3 men near the freight office who'd been watching her since she stepped off the train. 2 of his own hands, Gentry and Polk, who'd apparently decided to come to town that morning without mentioning it, and a 3rd man he didn't recognize who worked somewhere out near the Vane property. They weren't being subtle about it. Gentry said something, and the other 2 laughed, and whatever it wasn't kind. Silas started to turn toward them. Lenora put her hand on the wagon wheel, not touching him, just pausing near him, and said quietly, "Don't." He looked at her. "They want a reaction," she said. "Don't give them one." She climbed up onto the wagon seat without any help, settled the carpetbag between her feet, and sat looking straight ahead like the 3 men by the freight office didn't exist at all. After a moment, Silas climbed up beside her and picked up the reins, and they drove out of the station without looking back. He didn't know what to make of her yet, but he noticed she was right. The drive back to Blackstone Ridge took the better part of 2 hours. They didn't talk much. He pointed out the landmarks as they came to them: Sweetwater Creek, the south pasture, the tree line that marked the edge of his property. She listened without asking unnecessary questions, which he appreciated, and occasionally asked a short, specific one, which he appreciated more. "How many head?" she asked when they passed the cattle grazing on the lower flats. "About 300, down from 452 years ago." She didn't say anything to that, but she looked at the cattle with the kind of attention that meant she was filing it away somewhere. "The bunkhouse," she said, as they came up the long drive toward the main buildings. "Is it attached to the main house?" "Separate building. 30 yards east. And the cookhouse?" "Between them. Same structure as the kitchen, just the far side has its own entrance for the hands." She nodded. He noticed she was already mapping it out before they'd even stopped. Hicks was waiting in the yard when they pulled in. Hicks was 53 years old and had been at Blackstone Ridge longer than any of the other hands. Long enough that his loyalty was less a decision than a habit, and he generally served as something like a foreman, although Silas had never given him the official title or the official pay. Hicks had the look of a man who'd been told to act natural and was doing a spectacularly poor job of it. He nodded at Silas. He nodded at Lenora. He looked at the carpetbag. "Ma'am," he said. "Good evening," she said. There was a smell coming from the cookhouse that could most generously be described as unfortunate. Silas saw her register it, a slight shift in the set of her jaw, nothing more, and say nothing. Inside, the situation was worse than the smell. Dutch, the cook, had been drinking since roughly noon by the look of him, and had produced something for supper that might have started its life as a beef stew and then given up. 3 of the hands were sitting at the long table with the expressions of men who were eating because they had to, not because there was any pleasure in it. One of them had pushed his bowl to the side and was just drinking coffee. Lenora set her bags down inside the door. She looked at the table, at the stove, at Dutch, who was leaning against the far wall with an expression somewhere between defiance and embarrassment. Then she looked at Silas. "Where are the provisions stored?" she asked. "Larder's through there, second door." She nodded once, and that was all. That night she slept in the small room off the main house that had been empty since Silas's mother passed 6 years ago. He'd had Hicks air it out and put fresh linens on the bed, and he felt vaguely self-conscious about it in a way he couldn't quite justify, since this was a practical arrangement, and nobody had pretended otherwise. In the morning she was up before he was. He came downstairs at 5:30 and found the kitchen already warm, coffee already on, and a smell that had no business coming out of that room, something with herbs in it, and something else he couldn't identify, but that made his stomach respond before his brain caught up. She was standing at the stove with her hair still half-pinned, the way it falls when you've gotten dressed quickly and haven't had time to finish. She didn't turn around when he came in. "Sit down," she said. "It's almost ready." He sat down. He didn't know when was the last time someone had told him to sit down in his own kitchen, and he'd just done it. He thought about that while he drank his coffee. The first real test came on the third day. Dutch had slept off the previous night's drinking and come back to the cookhouse that morning with the confidence of a man who believes that what he was doing was just fine until someone interfered. He found Lenora at his stove. "That's my kitchen," he said. "You're welcome to it," she said, "when you can produce something the men will eat without that look on their faces." Dutch was not a small man. He had 20 years on her and about 100 pounds, and he drew himself up in the way men sometimes do when they're deciding how serious they want to be about something. "Lady," he said, "you got no idea how things run out here." "I have some idea," she said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She was still tending whatever was on the stove. "But if you'd like to stand here arguing about it, that's your choice. The men will just wait longer for their supper." Dutch looked at Silas, who had come to the cookhouse doorway during this exchange and was leaning against the frame watching. Silas didn't say anything. Dutch left. He came back at supper like nothing had happened, sat at the far end of the table, and ate 2 full bowls of whatever Lenora had made without commenting on it, which was, Silas suspected, about as close to a concession as Dutch was capable of. That evening she served roasted venison and fresh bread and a potato dish, with something in it he still couldn't name, an apple cobbler for dessert, and the table was a different thing entirely from what it had been 2 days before. Men who had been eating in silence started talking. Small things at first, something that had happened out on the range, a problem with the fence posts on the eastern line, then more. Gentry made a joke and someone laughed. Hicks, who generally ate quickly and left, stayed at the table an extra half hour. Silas watched all of this from his end of the table and didn't say anything either. But something had shifted. He could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds actually show up. These men hadn't just been hungry for food. They'd been hungry for the feeling that someone thought they were worth feeding properly. Most of its windows were dark, that they weren't just equipment, that they mattered enough for someone to put care into the thing that went on the table in front of them. Lenora had understood that without being told. She'd walked into a dying operation and within 72 hours had located the thing that mattered most and started addressing it. He found himself looking at her differently. It was Polk who pushed back first, because Polk always pushed back first. He was 24 years old and had a chip on a fence shoal the size of a fence rail and a particular problem with being told what to do by anyone he'd decided to disrespect in advance. He'd been disrespecting Lenora since the platform at Caldwell Station. Not loudly, not directly, just the tone, just the way he looked at her or didn't look at her, just the small performances of contempt that men like Polk mistake for authority. On the 4th evening, he pushed his bowl away before he'd finished it and said, loud enough for the table to hear, "Back east, they probably think this kind of cooking is something." The table went quiet. Lenora was at the stove. She didn't turn around immediately. There was a pause of about 3 full seconds, long enough that Polk started to look pleased with himself. Then she set down what she was holding and turned. "Finish what's in front of you," she said, "or go make your own supper. Either one is fine, but you'll do it without the commentary." "I'll say what I want," Polk said. "You will," she agreed. "And then you'll deal with the consequence of it. That's how it works." "What consequence? You gonna write me a letter?" "No," she said. "I'm going to remember it. And the next time you're cold and tired, and there's nothing between you and another long night except what comes out of this kitchen, I'll remember what you said at this table." Polk opened his mouth to say something else. Hicks, at the far end of the table, said quietly, "Polk, enough." And something in Hicks's tone, something final in it, made Polk close his mouth. Picked up his spoon. He finished the bowl. The table slowly started talking again, carefully at first, then normally. Lenora turned back to the stove. Silas hadn't moved a muscle. He'd been watching the whole thing from his chair, with his hands flat on the table, ready to say something, and then he hadn't needed to. She'd handled it cleanly, without cruelty, without backing down an inch. One by one, the other men shifted in their seats, recalibrating something about how they thought of this woman who'd arrived from the east with a battered carpetbag and a face like she'd already lived through several versions of difficult. She hadn't asked them to like her. She'd simply made herself impossible to dismiss. That night Silas couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark listening to the wind work its way through the gaps around the window frame. It always found the gaps, and thought about the ledger, about the cattle count, about the faces of his men at that table tonight, which had looked more alive than they had in months, about Malcolm Vane's most recent visit, which hadn't been a visit so much as a performance, the way Malcolm did everything, calculated and smooth, and designed to make you feel the walls closing in. Sign the paper, Malcolm had said. 4 days before your water runs dry. Silas, his tent signed. He also didn't have a plan. He'd been hoping stubbornness would be enough, which was the same mistake he'd been making for 2 years, and the land kept not caring. He got up at 3 in the morning to check on one of the horses that had been favoring its left foreleg, and on his way back past the main house he saw the light still on in the small room off the back. He stood outside in the cold for a moment, looking at that light under the door. She was still awake at 3 in the morning, and he had a sudden, irrational certainty that she wasn't awake because she couldn't sleep. She was awake because she was working on something. He didn't knock. It wasn't his business what she was doing at 3 in the morning. He went back to his own bed and lay there until the sky started to lighten, and when he finally came down at 5:30, she was already at the stove and the coffee was already on, and the expression on her dark, and the expression on face was the one she always wore in the morning's alert, contained, like someone who'd had all the sleep they needed and was now simply waiting for the day to start giving her problems. He didn't ask about the light, but he noticed it had been there, and he noticed it again the next night, and the one after that. 6 days after she arrived, Silas went to get a bridle from the supply room off the main house, a room he almost never used, which was precisely why the bridle was still in there from the last time someone had borrowed it 2 months ago and found something that wasn't a bridle. There was a stack of papers on the shelf that hadn't been there before. He might have ignored them, except that the top sheet had a name on it, written in careful, neat handwriting. Malcolm Vane. He stood very still for a moment. He picked up the stack. The first page was a telegram, then another, then a third, all of them addressed to a name he didn't recognize, all of them signed with Malcolm's initials, all of them containing language that was careful enough to be legally ambiguous but clear enough in their meaning to make the back of his neck go cold. She's there. Keep watching. Don't let her do anything before I'm ready. He read that line 3 times. His hands weren't quite steady when he set the papers back down. He went to find her. He found her in the cookhouse. She was at the work table with her back to the door, breaking down a side of venison with the kind of focused, practiced efficiency that told him she'd done it hundreds of times before. She didn't hear him come in over the sound of the work, or if she did, she gave no indication. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the papers in his hand. Lenora. She turned. She saw the papers, and something happened in her face, not guilt exactly, but a kind of recognition, the way a person looks when they've been waiting for a particular shoe to drop, and it finally has. She set down the knife. She wiped her hands on the cloth at her belt. She didn't say anything. These were in the supply room, he said, on the shelf. I know where they were. You want to tell me what they are? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, not standing in the doorway, I don't. He stepped inside. She moved to the far side of the work table, not backing away from him, just putting the table between them the way someone does when they want to have a conversation, rather than a confrontation. It was a small thing. He noticed it. How long have you been getting telegrams from Malcolm Vane? He said. I haven't been getting them. He's been sending them. That's not a different thing. It is, actually. She crossed her arms, not defensively, more like she was steadying herself. Those telegrams weren't sent to me. They were sent to a man named Drucker in Caldwell. Passes information to Malcolm. I've been intercepting them. Silas set the papers on the work table between them. You've been intercepting Malcolm Vane's messages. Yes. And how exactly are you able to do that? She looked at him. Because I know how Malcolm operates. I know who he uses and how he moves information. I've known for a long time. The cookhouse was quiet, except for the sound of the stove, and somewhere outside one of the horses shifting in its stall. Silas looked at the papers, then at her, then at the papers again. You need to tell me what's going on, he said. All of it. Right now. She pulled out one of the chairs at the long table and sat down. Not because she was tired, because she'd apparently decided this was going to take a while, and she was going to do it properly. Sit down, she said. He sat, and Lenora Voss began to tell him the truth. She didn't start with Malcolm. She started with her father, which Silas hadn't expected, and which told him the story was older and went deeper than he'd understood. Her father's name had been August Voss. He'd built a freight company in Pittsburgh over 30 years, not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily, the way men of his generation built things, one contract at a time, one relationship at a time, until the company was carrying goods across 4 states and had a reputation solid enough that banks trusted it without requiring much in the way of collateral. August Voss had 2 children, a daughter, Lenora, from his first marriage, and a son, a half-son, from his second wife, who had come into the family when Lenora was 11 years old. The boy's name was given to him by his mother. He went by Malcolm. Silas went still. He'd known Malcolm Vane for 3 years. He'd known the man was ambitious and dishonest and dangerous in the specific way that dangerous men always are, not hot-tempered, not reckless, but patient and calculating and perfectly willing to play a long game. He had not known anything about where Malcolm had come from. Malcolm Vane didn't discuss his past. Nobody in the valley did, really, because Malcolm had arrived already wealthy and already established, and the question of how he'd gotten that way had never seemed worth asking out loud. Half-brother, Silas said. Half-brother, Lenora confirmed, although we didn't grow up close. His mother didn't want me around him. She made that clear from the beginning, and my father, for reasons I've never entirely forgiven him, let her have her way about it. Malcolm and I were in the same house for 7 years, and spoke maybe 100 words to each other. He was pleasant enough when our father was in the room. Other times he was, she paused, chose the word carefully, absent. Not hostile, just absent. Like you weren't worth the energy of being hostile toward. She told it without emotion, which Silas suspected was the only way she could tell it at all. When her father died 12 years ago now, a heart attack at 61, the kind that takes a man down without warning the company, was supposed to go to both of them jointly. That was what the will said. That was what August Voss had apparently believed was the right and decent thing. Malcolm had been 23 at the time. He'd had a lawyer on retainer for 6 months before the funeral, which Lenora had not known until later. Within 14 months, he had maneuvered her out of any operational role in the company, taken control of the accounts, and begun systematically liquidating assets. She hadn't understood what was happening fast enough. She'd been 22, handling her grief, trusting that the law meant what it said and that what the will described was what would actually occur. By the time she understood what he was doing, most of it was already done. He didn't steal it in one dramatic move, she said. That's not how Malcolm works. He takes small pieces, time, so that by the time you notice, there's not enough left to fight him over. She looked down at the table. He sold the company's main contracts, transferred the money through a series of accounts I couldn't trace, and then dissolved the company. What remained the debts he left in my name? He left you the debts. Yes. While he walked away with the money. He walked away with about $40,000 that belonged to both of us. He used it to come west and buy land. She looked up. Land that is now the largest cattle operation in this valley, apart from what you still hold. Silas sat back in his chair. He was aware of a kind of roaring sound somewhere at the back of his skull, which was what happened to him when he was furious and trying not to show it. How much of the debt did he leave you? $11,000. He closed his eyes for a moment. It took me 8 years, she said. Flat, matter of fact, no request for sympathy in the words. Factory work, mostly. 2 years in a textile mill. Then bookkeeping for a manufacturing company when I'd taught myself enough arithmetic. Kept records of everything. Every payment. Every penny. I also spent those 8 years collecting every document I could find relating to what he did the transfers, the accounts, the contracts he sold, the names of the lawyers he used, the men who helped him. I have a ledger, Mr. Rourke, a complete one, with everything documented. Where is it? She reached into the pocket of her dress and placed a small worn book on the table between them. Silas looked at it, but didn't touch it yet. You answered my advertisement, he said slowly, because my ranch is on Malcolm's border. Yes, you came here deliberately. Yes, you planned all of this. I planned to be in a position where I could act, she said. I didn't plan everything. I didn't plan Dutch, or the fact that your fence line on the east is held together with old wire and optimism, or she stopped herself. I didn't come here to deceive you about who I am. I came here because you were fighting the same man I've been fighting for a decade, and I thought together we might have a better chance than either of us does alone. The silence stretched out between them. Silas could hear the wind starting up outside, the way it did every evening, when the temperature began to drop that low, steady pressure against the walls of whatever building you were in, like the land reminding you it was still out there. You should have told me, he said. I know. When you got off that train, you should have told me. I know. She didn't flinch from it. I didn't know yet if I could trust you. That's the truth. I'd trusted the wrong people before, Mr. Rourke, and it cost me 8 years of my life. I needed to see what kind of man you were before I hand you the only evidence I have. He didn't say anything for a long time. He picked up the ledger, turned it over in his hands, opened it the middle, and looked at a page of close, careful handwriting with columns of figures and dates and names. Then he set it back down. He's going to make his move soon, Silas said. It wasn't a question. He'd felt it for weeks, the gathering pressure of it, like weather building on the horizon. He already has, Lenora said. That's what the telegrams are. He's telling Drucker to wait. He's not ready yet, but he's close. Close to what? She looked at him steadily. Close to taking your water. Silas didn't sleep at all that night. He sat in the kitchen with the ledger open on the table and went through it page by page with a lamp turned up as high as it would go, reading every entry, cross-referencing dates, tracing the movement of money through the networks of names Lenora had documented with the kind of methodical patience that only came from years of careful, private fury. The woman was not guessing. She had receipts. She had signed documents. She had statements from 3 different men who had worked for Malcolm during the liquidation and whose names and address she'd tracked down over the course of several years. She had a letter from the bank that had held the main company account, obtained through means she hadn't explained, and that Silas decided not to ask about tonight, which showed a transfer of $38,000 to an account held under a different name, a name he didn't recognize until he looked at the last 3 letters of it and understood that Malcolm had used a partial anagram. The man had been thorough. He'd also been, Silas thought, very slightly arrogant. The kind of arrogant that comes from success, from getting away with something once, and then again, and then enough times that you stop worrying about the people you left behind, because you've convinced yourself they aren't capable of following you. He'd left Lenora Voss with $11,000 in debt and apparently made the calculation that a 22-year-old woman in Pittsburgh had no possible way of ever catching up with him in Wyoming. It was a reasonable calculation. It was also wrong. By the time dawn started to gray the windows, Silas had read the ledger twice and understood what he was looking at. He closed it and sat for a while with his hands flat on the cover, thinking. Then he got up and started the coffee. Lenora came downstairs at 5:15. She saw the ledger closed on the table and him standing at the stove and seemed to understand that the night had involved more than just sleep. Well, she said. It's enough, he said, if we can get it to the right person. The territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne. That's a full day's ride. I know. She poured herself a cup of coffee. But it would have to be the right moment. If Malcolm finds out before the warrants are issued, he'll move the money and disappear, and we'll have the documents and nothing to attach them to. Silas turned around. He's going to take the water first. That's what you said last night. That's what I believe. Then we don't have time to wait for the right moment. She looked at him over her coffee cup. No, she said. We probably don't. The trouble started 3 days later. Not with Malcolm directly. Malcolm never showed up directly when he could send someone else, but with two of his hands, who rode onto the lower pasture on a Tuesday morning and started moving Silas's fence stakes. Hicks saw it first and came to the main house at a trot, which was fast for Hicks. He knocked twice and opened the door before Silas could answer it, which told Silas all he needed to know about the urgency. 2 of Vane's men on the south line, Hicks said. Moving stakes. Silas got his hat. How many of ours are out there? Gentry and the new kid Cole get Polk and Mercer. Stay between them and the cattle. Hicks turned to go. Lenora appeared at the top of the stairs. She'd heard the whole thing. Don't escalate it, she said. Silas looked up at her. That's what he wants, she said. He wants you to throw the first punch so he can claim you started it. Don't touch his men. Move your people to the line and hold it, but don't touch anyone. Silas held her gaze for a second. Then he nodded once and went out. He rode to the south line with Hicks and Polk and Mercer and found Gentry and young Cole already planted between the Vane men and the herd, nobody touching anybody, but the air tight enough to feel it. The 2 strangers were big men, the kind Malcolm specifically hired because of how they looked, and one of them had a smile on his face that wasn't a friendly smile. Mr. Rourke, the smiling one said, just clarifying the boundary line. Mr. Vane believes there's been some confusion about where it falls. There's no confusion, Silas said. He kept his voice level. Those stakes mark the line as recorded at the county assessor's office. You're on my sides of them. Mr. Vane's surveyor would disagree. Then Mr. Vane's surveyor can come show me his work. Silas stopped his horse about 10 feet from them. He kept his hands visible and loose. You're not moving those stakes. The smiling man looked at him. The smile didn't waver. He looked at the 4 Rourke hands behind Silas. He looked back at his own partner. And then, in the way of men who've been paid to make a point rather than actually start a war, he turned his horse. We'll be in touch, he said. They rode back toward Vane's property at a walk, not hurrying, making clear they were leaving on their own terms. Silas watched them go until they were out of sight. Hicks rode up beside him. That won't be the last of it. No, Silas said. It won't. When he got back to the ranch, Lenora was in the supply larder doing an inventory with a pencil and a piece of paper, moving tins and sacks and making notes in her careful handwriting. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment. How many days of provisions do we have? He asked. She kept writing. If I'm careful, 3 weeks for the men. Maybe 4. She turned a tin over, looked at the bottom, made another note. The real problem isn't food. It's the water situation. If Malcolm moves on the creek, he will. She turned around. When? Soon. The fence stunt this morning was a message. He's letting me know he can reach me from multiple directions. She leaned against the shelf with her pencil tucked between her fingers. He did the same thing in Pittsburgh at the end. A series of small moves, first to make you feel surrounded. Then one large one that you've already been weakened to resist. He almost did it here too, Silas admitted. It cost him something to say it. 2 months ago, I was close to signing his paper. Why didn't you? He thought about it honestly. Because I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. He paused. That's not a great reason. It kept the ranch, she said. It doesn't need to be a great reason. There was a moment between them that was different from the moments before it. Most of its windows were dark. Not quite comfortable, they were still 2 people who'd known each other less than 2 weeks, and had more unresolved things between them than either had fully addressed. But something had shifted since the night in the cookhouse, since the ledger, since the morning with the coffee, when he'd said it's enough and meant it. They were operating as a unit now in a way that hadn't been true before, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so directly. If he moves on the creek, Lenora said, how long do the cattle last? 3 days of summer heat, maybe 4. She absorbed that. Then we need to move before he does. We need to move before he knows we're moving. She looked at him steadily. I need to go to Cheyenne. I know. If he has anyone watching the ranch, and he does, there's a man named Briggs who sits in a line of trees about a half-mile east and thinks he can't be seen from the kitchen window, then he'll know if I leave. Briggs, Silas said. I've seen him. Then we need him to see something other than what's actually happening. It was Hicks who came up with the working plan, which surprised Silas a little and probably shouldn't have, since Hicks had 40 years of surviving difficult situations and a practical intelligence that tended to surface quietly when it was needed. His suggestion was simple. Lenora would leave on the morning supply wagon, which made the run to Caldwell twice a week, and which was driven by a hand named Abe, who was methodical and quiet, and who Malcolm's people had apparently decided was too boring to monitor closely. She would not take a horse, which would be noticed. She would She would sit in the back of the wagon, which would not be noticed, and she would get to Caldwell and take the train from there to Cheyenne. Abe won't say anything, Hicks said. He's not the kind. You're sure about him? Silas said. I've known Abe 12 years. He's sure. Lenora listened to all of this sitting at the far end of the kitchen table, and when Hicks had finished, she said, What about the ledger? It goes with you, Silas said. If something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you. She looked at him flatly. Mr. Rourke. Silas. A beat. Silas. If something happens to me on the road or at the station, or if Malcolm has someone watching the train, which he might, then the ledger disappears, and we're back to nothing. There needs to be a copy. Silas thought about it. How long would it take you to copy it? I've been working on it for 3 nights. She reached into her dress pocket and produced a second, thinner book. This is a clean copy of the most critical pages. Transfers, amounts, dates, the bank letter. Enough to establish the fraud even without the originals. She placed both books on the table. I take the original. You keep the copy. If either of us is stopped, the other still has something. He looked at the 2 books on the table. 3 nights. She'd been up until 3 in the morning, 3 nights, running, making a copy of evidence by lamplight, without telling him, because she'd understood before he had, that the plan would eventually require it. He thought about the light under her door, and felt something tighten in his chest that he didn't examine too closely. When does Abe leave? He said. Thursday morning, Hicks said. 2 days, Lenora said. Is 2 days enough time on your end? It'll have to be, Silas said. The day before she was supposed to leave, Polk quit. He didn't do it quietly. Polk wasn't capable of doing things quietly. He came to the main house after supper, while the other hands were still finishing their coffee, and told Silas he was taking a position at Malcolm Vane's operation starting Monday. Most of its windows were dark, and that 2 other men, a hand named Reeves, who'd been at the ranch 8 months, and young Cole, who'd been there less than 6 weeks, were going with him. Silas stood at the kitchen door and felt the specific cold of a man watching something he'd predicted happen in exactly the way he'd predicted it. Higher wages, he said. Better situation, Polk said. He had the decency to sound slightly uncomfortable about it, which Silas supposed was something. No offense meant. Then take none with you, Silas said. Pick up your pay from Hicks in the morning. Polk nodded. Turned to go. Stopped. Rourke, he said, and there was something different in his voice now, something that might have been an actual warning rather than theater. Malcolm Vane doesn't lose. Not around here. Whatever you're planning, he's going to know about it. He always knows. Then he left. Silas closed the door. Lenora was in the kitchen. She'd heard all of it. She was standing at the table with her hands flat on the surface, not doing anything, just standing. How many does that leave us? She asked. 6, counting Hicks. She nodded slowly. And Vane has how many? 20, maybe more. She absorbed that without visibly reacting to it, which he appreciated, because there wasn't anything useful to do with the numbers right now, and reacting to them would have just made the room heavier. Then Thursday matters more than I thought, she said. It was already going to matter, he said. She looked at him. Silas. It was the first time she'd used his first name without him prompting it. He noticed that. When I get to Cheyenne, she said, I need you to keep the ranch from doing anything irreversible until I get back. Define irreversible. Don't ride at Malcolm's men. Don't fire at anyone unless they fire first. If they move on the creek, she stopped. Took a breath. Hold the high ground above it. Don't charge the fortified position. Promise me that. He looked at her for a long moment. 6 men against 20 or more, and she was asking him to hold rather than charge, which went against every instinct he had about how you dealt with men who were taking something from you. But she was right, and he knew she was right, and the knowing of it sat in his chest like a stone. I'll hold, he said. She held his gaze a second longer, like she was testing whether he meant it. Get some sleep, she said. You look like you haven't in days. You either, she almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Thursday morning, 5:45. The yard was still dark, the sky just beginning to do that thing it does in early summer, where the darkness gets thinner, before it gets any brighter. Abe had the wagon hitched and waiting. He was loading the last of the empty barrels without looking at anyone, which was how Abe expressed discretion. Lenora came out of the main house with the carpetbag she'd arrived and a second smaller bag Silas recognized as the one that had been on her shoulder at the station. She was dressed for travel, the same dark blue dress, the same worn boots, a heavier coat than she'd been wearing inside. Hicks was standing near the barn. He nodded at her. She nodded back. She crossed the yard to where Silas was standing near the wagon and stopped in front of him. The copy of the ledger was in his shirt pocket. The original was in her bag. "If I'm not back in 4 days," she started. "You'll be back in 4 days. Silas, you'll be back," he said, and his voice had an edge in it that surprised him. "Take the ledger to the marshal. Tell him everything. Don't leave until you have something in writing." She looked at him steadily. "And if he stalls? Some of these officials, tell him Malcolm Vane has a man watching Blackstone Ridge right now, and if he doesn't move in 72 hours, there may not be a ranch to make the arrest at." He paused. That should focus him. Something shifted in her face. Not softness exactly. Lenora Voss didn't do softness easily. He was learning, but a kind of recognition. Like she was seeing something in him she hadn't been completely certain was there. "Don't do anything stupid while I'm gone," she said. "Define stupid. You know what stupid is." "Yeah," he said. "I do." She climbed into the back of the wagon among the empty barrels, and Abe clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon rolled out of the yard in the thin pre-dawn dark. And Silas stood in the middle of the empty yard, watching until it was out of sight. Then he turned to Hicks. "Get the men," he said. "All of them. I want everyone in the barn in 10 minutes. Hicks looked at him. "Something happening?" "Something's about to happen," Silas said, "and I want us ready when it does." He walked to the barn without looking at the tree line to the east, where Briggs was watching from his position among the cottonwoods, thinking he couldn't be seen from the kitchen window. Let him watch, Silas thought. Let him report back that the wagon went to town and Rourke looks worried and the ranch is down to 6 men. Let Malcolm think he already knows everything. Because Lenora Voss was on that wagon with the original ledger in her bag and 12 years of documented evidence, and a patience that had outlasted everything Malcolm had thrown at her, and Malcolm Vane, for all his calculating intelligence, had made the same mistake he'd made in Pittsburgh. He'd looked at her and decided she wasn't worth worrying about. He was going to find out how wrong he was. But not yet. Not until she was safely in Cheyenne. Not until the right person had read every page of that ledger and understood what they were looking at. Silas went into the barn. His six remaining men were gathering in the lamplight with the careful faces of men who understood the situation was serious and were waiting to find out exactly how serious. He stood in front of them and thought about what Lenora had said. Hold the high ground. Don't charge the fortified position. Hold. Listen carefully, he said, because I'm only going to say this once. He said it once and he meant it. And the 6 men standing in the lamplight of that barn knew by his tone that this was not a morning for questions or complaints. He told them what he knew. Not everything, not Lenora, not the ledger, not Cheyenne, because some information becomes dangerous the moment more people carry it. But he told them enough. Malcolm Vane was going to move on Sweetwater Creek, probably within the next 2 days, maybe sooner. When he did, he would use armed men, enough of them to make a direct confrontation look like suicide. The goal was not to win a fight. The goal was to hold position long enough for help to arrive. Gentry raised his hand, which he never did. What kind of help? The legal kind, Silas said, if it comes. And if it doesn't? Silas looked at him. Then we'll deal with that when we know it's not coming. It wasn't a satisfying answer. Nobody in the barn pretended it was. Most of its windows were dark. But these were men who had stayed when others left, which meant they'd already made their calculation, and the calculation wasn't about the odds. Hicks stood at the back with his arms crossed and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Mercer, who had a wife in Caldwell and a child he didn't talk about, looked at the floor for a moment, and then looked up and nodded. The others followed. That was it. No speeches? Nope, promises Silas couldn't keep. Just 6 men in a barn in the gray early morning deciding to stay put. He sent them back to their work and stood alone in the barn for a while after, listening to the horses and the wind and the particular silence of a place holding its breath. The first full day without Lenora was harder than he'd expected, and he was irritated with himself for finding it hard. She hadn't been at the ranch 3 weeks. A man who let himself get dependent on someone's presence in under 3 weeks had a problem with his own steadiness, and Silas Rourke was supposed to be a steady man. But the kitchen was wrong without her in it. Not empty Hicks could cook well enough to keep men alive, and he took over the morning meal without being asked, but different in a way Silas couldn't quite put his finger on and didn't want to spend too much time trying. He kept the copy of the ledger in his shirt pocket. He checked it was there more often than was rational. Mercer reported mid-morning that Briggs was still in his position in the cottonwoods, which meant Malcolm's information was still running through the same channel, which meant so far the wagon plan had worked. As far as Malcolm knew, Lenora Voss had made a routine supply run to Caldwell and come back. Abe had returned with the empty wagon at noon and said nothing to anyone, and Silas had not looked at him or acknowledged him in any visible way because Briggs was still watching. The afternoon passed in the peculiar, suspended tension of waiting for something you can't prevent from coming. Silas walked his fence lines. He checked the water level at Sweetwater Creek, which was still running clear and full, and stood at its bank for a moment looking upstream toward the ridge where Malcolm's men would eventually come. The terrain there was awkward. The creek ran through a narrow cut between 2 rises, and if someone wanted to barricade it, they'd put men on the high ground on both sides and force anyone defending it to approach from lower elevation. It was the obvious move. Malcolm always made the obvious move because the obvious move was obvious for a reason. Hold the high ground. Don't charge. He heard Lenora's voice saying it and made himself walk away from the creek before he could start working out how to charge anyway. The second started badly. At first light, Hicks came to the house with the look he wore when the news was worse than he wanted to deliver it. Silas was already up, already dressed, already on his second cup of coffee that he wasn't tasting. "Creek's blocked," Hicks said. Silas set down the cup. "How many men?" Couldn't get close enough to count. 8, maybe 10. They came in overnight. There's a barricade across the narrow's timber and rock. Looks like they worked at it for hours. And they've got the high ground on both sides, like you said they would. Silas stood very still for a moment. He did the arithmetic he didn't want to do. 3 days for the cattle. Maybe 4 if the temperature dropped, which it wouldn't this time of year. That was the clock. Against that clock, he had 6 men, one of whom was 53 years old, and another of whom had a wife and child in Caldwell. Against that clock, he also had Lenora Voss, somewhere between here and Cheyenne with a ledger in her bag. He didn't know if she'd made it to Cheyenne yet. He didn't know if the marshal had seen her. He didn't know if the marshal would move quickly or slowly or at all, because territorial officials had a wide range of responses to evidence of financial fraud, and some of those responses involved a lot of careful deliberation. He had no way to get a message to her. He'd understood that from the beginning and had accepted it as a condition of the plan, and it had seemed acceptable in the abstract. It felt considerably less acceptable now. "All right," he said. "All right what?" Hicks said. "We ride to the creek. We hold position above the barricade. We don't engage unless they fire first." Hicks was quiet for a moment. She said that. She was right. Another moment? Silas. "If they start pushing cattle, I know." His voice came out harder than he intended. Pulled it back. "I know, Hicks. We hold. That's the play." Hicks's windows were dark. Hicks looked at him the way Hicks sometimes looked at him, with the particular expression of a man who has known you long enough to see the thing you're trying not to show. He didn't say anything about it. "I'll get the men," he said, and went out. They rode to the creek in a line, 6 of them, in the early morning cool that wouldn't last. The ride took 20 minutes on good ground, and Silas spent most of it not looking at the sky, not counting hours, not calculating things he couldn't control. The barricade was worse than Hicks had described. It was substantial, not something thrown up in an hour, but a deliberate construction of heavy timber and stacked rock that crossed the creek's narrows completely, backed up enough water on the upstream side to already be visible as a swelling, and had been engineered with the specific intent of being difficult to remove quickly. The men who'd built it were now positioned on both rises above it, spread out, not clustered. Malcolm had hired people who knew what they were doing. The smiling man from the fence line incident was up on the left rise. He had the same smile. "Morning, Rourke," he called down. "Didn't expect to see you this early." Silas held his horse on the slope below and looked at the barricade and did not look at the smiling man. "That water belongs to Blackstone Ridge by legal right," he said. His voice carried well in the morning stillness. "Every man up there knows it. Mr. Vane's surveyor has some different thoughts about that," the smiling man said. He seemed genuinely to enjoy this part. "Mr. Vane's surveyor can put his thoughts in writing and file them at the assessor's office," Silas said. "Until then, this creek runs through my property, and those men are trespassing on it." "Is that so?" The smiling man looked over his shoulder at someone Silas couldn't see. A signal of some kind. "Well, Mr. Rourke, you've got about 4 or 5 men there. Best I can count. We've got the high ground and a few more bodies than that. So maybe you want to think about how this ends before you make it into something." Silas didn't answer that. He turned his horse slightly and positioned it parallel to the barricade, and his men spread out on either side of him, and they just sat there. The smiling man waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. "You just going to sit there?" he called. "Yes," Silas said. They sat there for 6 hours. It was not comfortable. The sun climbed and the shade retreated, and the water that had been blocked was already audible, a different sound than running water. A heavier, stiller sound that meant depth, increasing behind the barrier. Cattle down on the lower pasture would reach the creek at their usual time in the afternoon and find it changed. And they'd mill and push, and some of them would panic, and the men would have to work hard to keep them from doing something stupid. Gentry rode down to handle the cattle at 2 in the afternoon. He came back an hour later, looking sunburned and grim. "They're unsettled," he said. "Not critical yet. Another day, they'll start showing it." Silas nodded. On the high ground, Malcolm's men had settled into their position with the ease of people who'd been paid to wait, and were fine with waiting. They had shade that Silas's men didn't have. They had water. They had the comfort of the high ground, which was psychological as much as tactical. Silas sat on his horse and did not charge. It was the hardest thing he'd done in years. Harder than signing the matrimonial contract. Harder than watching men leave. The instinct to act, to push, to do something rather than sit here absorbing Malcolm's slow pressure. It was a physical thing, a pressure in his chest and his shoulders and his hands that wanted to translate into movement. He sat still. At 3 in the afternoon, one of Malcolm's men on the right rise fired a single shot into the ground, about 10 feet in front of Gentry's horse. Not close enough to be a genuine attack. Close enough to be a provocation. Gentry's horse shied. Gentry controlled it. He looked at Silas. Silas shook his head once. Gentry turned back toward the barricade and sat. The smiling man called down, "Careful with those horses, gentlemen. Ground's uneven up here. Accidents happen." Mercer said something very quiet under his breath. Silas decided not to hear. They held. At dusk, they rode back to the ranch, rotating 2 men to watch the creek overnight, and Silas sat in the kitchen in the dark and put his hand on the copy of the ledger in his pocket and did the arithmetic again and came up with the same answer. If Lenora had caught the train Thursday morning, she'd have been in Cheyenne by Thursday evening. If she'd gone straight to the marshal's office, and she would have because that was Lenora, she'd have been there Thursday night or Friday morning. It was now Friday evening. The marshal's office worked on its own schedule. The kind of evidence Lenora was presenting required review. It required someone with legal authority to read through it carefully and understand what they were looking at. That took time. Even in an urgent situation, it took time. He had maybe 2 more days before the cattle situation became irreversible. He got up and went to the barn and checked the horses and came back and sat down again. He did this twice. The third time, Hicks appeared in the kitchen doorway in his long underwear and work pants and said, without preamble, "Go to sleep. I'm not tired. I didn't ask if you were tired. Go to sleep. Worrying in a chair doesn't make the sun come up faster." Silas looked at him. Hicks had a point which was annoying. "How are you so calm?" Hicks pulled out a chair and sat down across from him with the unhurried ease of a man who has made peace with uncertainty through sheer repetition of encountering it. "Because I've been in bad spots before," he said. "Mostly they worked out. Some of them didn't." He shrugged one shoulder. "The ones that didn't, worrying beforehand, didn't make any difference. This one matters more than most. They all matter more than most when you're in them." Hicks looked at him steadily. "She's capable, Silas. Whatever else she is genuinely capable." If the marshal can be moved, she'll move him. And if he can't be moved, she'll find someone who can. Silas was quiet for a moment. She told me not to do anything stupid. Solid advice. I've been sitting on a hillside watching men dam my creek all day and not shooting anyone. I'd call that a significant personal achievement. Hicks almost smiled. Get some sleep, he said again. This time Silas went. He didn't sleep much, but he went. Saturday morning arrived with a clarity that felt mocking brilliant sky, good air, the kind of morning that made the land look like it was doing you a favor. Silas rode back to the creek at first light with Hicks and Mercer and found the two overnight men, Gentry and a hand named Stubbs, looking exhausted but in one piece. Nothing had happened overnight. The barricade held. The water upstream was noticeably higher than it had been yesterday. The cattle were going to find the situation significantly worse by afternoon. And then, at mid-morning, Malcolm came himself. Silas heard the horses, before he saw them a group of riders coming down from the North Ridge, 8 of them, and Malcolm at the front on a gray horse that probably cost more than Silas's kitchen roof. He rode the way he did everything, smooth and controlled, and performing the performance of a man who is never surprised by anything because he arranged it all himself. He stopped about 30 yards from Silas's position. He looked at the 6 men. He looked at the barricade behind him, at his own men on the rise. Then he looked at Silas, and the expression on Shisteshon's face was the one Silas had seen twice before, the particular, almost sympathetic look of a man who believes he has already won and is taking a moment to acknowledge it. Silas, he said, like they were old friends discussing something minor. Malcolm, I thought we might have a conversation without the theater. He gestured vaguely at the barricade behind him, as if it were someone else's doing. The water situation is unfortunate. Nobody wants dead cattle. I certainly don't. Then remove the barricade. I could do that, Malcolm said. Or you could sign the paper you should have signed 3 weeks ago, and we can settle all of this cleanly. There's nothing clean about stealing a man's water. Malcolm tilted his head and almost smiled. That's a strong word, Silas. What I'm doing is applying pressure to a negotiation. It's a business practice. The business practice of a man who doesn't have a legal argument. Something flickered behind Malcolm's eyes. Barely visible, quickly gone. I have surveyors who would disagree. I have lawyers who would disagree at length. He looked at the 6 men, the visible count, the obvious math, a difficult situation. Silas looked at him. He was aware with a very specific clarity that Malcolm didn't know. He didn't know about the ledger. He didn't know about Cheyenne. He didn't know that his half-sister was sitting in a marshal's office somewhere with 12 years of documented evidence of what he'd done, because he'd looked at Lenora Voss and made the calculation that she wasn't capable of following him. The man sitting on the gray horse 30 yards away had no idea that the thing he'd spent a decade believing was the truth was about to come apart. Silas made himself hold that knowledge still and say nothing. I'll need to think about it, he said. Malcolm blinked. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected defiance, had come prepared for it, probably enjoyed it in some way, because it confirmed his sense of himself as the harder man. Quiet, undramatic answer confused him. Think about it, he repeated. Yes, give me until tomorrow morning, a long pause. Malcolm recalculated something. Tomorrow morning, he said slowly. That's all right. Tomorrow morning, Silas. And then we settle this one way or another. He turned the gray horse and rode back toward the ridge, his men following. Hicks moved his horse up beside Silas and said very quietly, tomorrow morning. I know. She needs to be back by tomorrow morning. I know, Hicks. A beat. Do you have a plan for if she's not? Silas looked at the barricade, at the water banking up behind it, at the empty hillside where Malcolm's men had returned to their positions. I'm working on it, he said. He spent Saturday afternoon thinking about things he couldn't control, which was not productive, and which he did anyway, because there was no other option. He thought about the train schedule. He thought about the marshal's office in Cheyenne, which he'd been to once, 7 years ago, for a land dispute that had been settled anticlimactically. He thought about Lenora, sitting at his desk from some official who might or might not understand what she was handing him, making her case in that clear, flat, utterly direct way she had, not asking for sympathy, not performing distress, just laying the evidence down piece by piece, the way she'd laid the ledger on the table in his kitchen. He thought, with a discomfort he couldn't quite assign to a specific cause, about the fact that She'd copied that ledger by lamplight over 3 nights without telling him. Not because she was hiding it from him, because she'd seen what needed to be done and done it without waiting to be asked or noticed or thanked. He'd been around people who worked that way his whole life. His mother had worked that way. He'd just forgotten, somewhere in the long, grinding difficulty of the last 2 years, what it felt like to have someone beside you who was actually on your side. At 4 o'clock, he went to the cookhouse and started supper, because nobody else was going to. He was a middling cook at best and knew it. The meal he produced was adequate in the way of things that are functional without being enjoyable. But the men ate it. Hicks ate 2 portions, which Silas suspected was an act of loyalty rather than hunger. Nobody talked much. The weight of tomorrow morning was in the room with them, sitting at the table the way a bad season sits in a room not spoken about, but present in every silence. After supper, Gentry stayed to help clean up, which was unusual enough that Silas noticed it. They washed the dishes side by side for a while. Then Gentry said, without looking up from the pot he was scrubbing, "She's coming back." Didn't say anything. "I'm just saying," Gentry said. "She's the kind of person who does what she says she's going to do. You can tell that about a person." "You mocked her on the platform at Caldwell," Silas said. Gentry went still for a moment. "Yeah." He went back to scrubbing. "I was wrong about that." They finished the dishes and Gentry left, and Silas stood alone in the cookhouse for a while, in the smell of the meal and the soap, and the particular absence of whoever wasn't there. Sunday morning. The deadline he'd bought with those 5 words, "Give me until tomorrow morning," was running out, and Lenora wasn't back, and Silas was standing in the yard in the early light, doing the very thing he'd promised not to do, which was working out how to charge Malcolm's position. He had it mapped in his head. The approach from the southeast, where the terrain gave slightly better cover. The timing early, before the heat, when men who'd been sitting on a hillside for 2 days were stiff and tired and had been lulled by 2 days of nothing happening. The 6 men he had and how he'd position them and what the first 10 seconds would look like and what the odds were. The odds were not good. He was standing there working through the math he didn't like when he heard Hicks at the fence near the road make a sound. Not a word. Just a sound, a short, sharp exhale that Silas had never heard from him before. Turned. Down the road, coming from the direction of Caldwell, there was dust. The kind of dust that comes from multiple horses moving at a pace above a walk. He stared at it, trying to resolve it into something identifiable, and his hand went to the rifle at his saddle, without him deciding to put it there. The dust resolved into riders. A lot of them. More than 10. Coming in a line, moving steadily, and at the front, he stared at the front, was a wagon he recognized. Abe's wagon. Abe on the seat with his characteristic expression of a man who finds most things either adequate or inadequate and is currently leaning toward adequate. And beside Abe on the wagon seat was Lenora. Silas stood completely still. She was back. She was in one piece, sitting up straight on that wagon seat with the carpetbag between her feet and the expression of a woman who has done the thing she set out to do and is now arriving to find out whether it was in time. Behind the wagon came the riders. He counted them without meaning to 12, 15 more. Men he didn't know in clothing that resolved as they got closer into something that was not exactly a uniform, but had that character about it. Federal. At the front of the group, on a horse that outclassed everything else on the road, was a man Silas didn't recognize. He was somewhere between 45 and 55, lean, with a gray-streaked beard and an expression of professional calm. On his coat was a badge that caught the morning light. The wagon pulled into the yard and stopped. Lenora climbed down before Abe had fully set the brake. She looked at Silas across the yard, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was exactly like the first moment at the station, except that everything between those 2 moments had changed every calculation either of them would ever make about the other. "The marshal's name is Garrett," she said. "He read the ledger on Friday night." She glanced at his shirt pocket. "He's going to want the copy too." Silas reached into his pocket and produced the thin book. Marshal Garrett had brought his horse forward and was looking at the 2 of them with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things and arrived at a general understanding that most situations make more sense once you know the people in them. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "I understand you have a water problem." "About a mile northeast," Silas said. 10 or more armed men and a barricade across Sweetwater Creek. Warrants are issued for Malcolm Vane and for a man named Drucker in Caldwell, Garrett said. He said it the way he probably said most things, evenly, without drama, like a man who had long since stopped finding his own authority impressive. My jurisdiction covers the territory. I'd appreciate it if you'd ride with us. I'll get my horse, Silas said. He turned to get his horse and found Lenora walking alongside him, the carpetbag still in her hand. You didn't charge, she said. It wasn't quite a question. No. Was it close? He thought about standing in the yard this morning working out the odds. Some, he admitted. She nodded. Not surprised. Not relieved exactly. More like someone checking off a thing they'd hoped would be true and finding that it was. He's up at the creek, Silas said. He came himself yesterday. He told me to think about signing until this morning. He thinks he's won, she said. He still thinks that. She looked at him. There was something in her face he hadn't seen there before, not quite fear, because Lenora Voss didn't do fear the way other people did, but something adjacent to it. The particular vulnerability of a person who has been moving towards something for a very long time and is now close enough to it that the possibility of it not working is suddenly real in a way it couldn't be when it was far away. He's going to see me, she said. Yes. He didn't know I was here. He didn't know it was me. I know. She looked at the road ahead, at the Marshall's riders milling in the yard, at the dust their horses had raised, still hanging in the morning air. Going to be, she started. It's going to be what it is, Silas said, not unkindly. You did the work. You brought the evidence. You brought the marshal. Whatever he feels when he sees you, that's his problem now, not yours. She was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in her jaw, a small tightening, and then release. All right, she said. He brought his horse out. He checked the rifle. He looked at the 6 men who were already mounted and waiting with the ready patience of people who had sat on a hillside for 2 days and were now prepared for something to actually happen. Stay behind the marshal's riders, he told them. This ends legally. Whatever you see up there, it ends legally. Hicks, mounted and straight-backed, gave him the nod that meant he understood and would make sure the others did too. Silas rode to the front of the group, beside Marshal Garrett. Lenora took the second wagon seat that Abe had apparently been saving without being asked to, because Abe was reliable like that. And they rode toward Sweetwater Creek, and the dust they raised hung in the bright morning air, and somewhere on the ridge above the barricade, a man who had spent 12 years believing he was untouchable was about to find out what it cost to miscalculate a woman. He'd decided wasn't worth worrying about. Malcolm Vane had been wrong about a great many things. He was about to learn all of them at once. The ride to Sweetwater Creek took 20 minutes that felt considerably longer than that. Marshal Garrett rode at the front with 2 of his deputies flanking him, and Silas rode beside him because Garrett had asked him to, and because Silas knew the terrain and the approach better than anyone else in the group. Behind them came the rest of the Federal riders, 15 in total. Silas had counted them properly now, and behind those came Abe's wagon with Lenora on the seat, which Silas had argued about briefly and lost. I'm not staying at the ranch, she'd said in the yard before they left. It could get dangerous up there. It's already dangerous up there. The difference is that Malcolm doesn't know I'm coming, and that matters. She'd looked at him with the expression that had stopped being readable to him as stubbornness and had started being readable as something else, a kind of certainty that didn't require agreement. When he sees me, it will mean something to him. It will do something to his thinking. You need him thinking about me rather than about his options. Silas had looked at Garrett, who had listened to this exchange with his professional calm, and then said, simply, she's right. And that had been the end of the argument. So Lenora was on the wagon, and the wagon was behind 15 armed federal deputies, and Silas was telling himself this was a reasonable arrangement while simultaneously monitoring the tree line on the left with the specific alertness of a man who knows that reasonable arrangements have a way of becoming complicated in the field. Garrett rode without talking much, which Silas appreciated. He asked if its windows were dark. He asked 2 questions during the ride: the number of men he could expect on the high ground and the layout of the terrain at the narrows, and absorbed the answers without commentary. He had the quality of a man who had done difficult things many times and had learned that the preparation happened before you arrived, and once you were riding, you were just riding. Vane will try to negotiate, Silas said at one point. That's his first move when he's cornered. He'll present it as a reasonable discussion. They usually do, Garrett said. He's good at it. He sounds reasonable. That's the thing about him, he always sounds reasonable. Garrett glanced at him sideways. Mr. Rourke, I've read the ledger Miss Voss brought me. I read it twice, Friday night and Saturday morning. I've been doing this work for 19 years. A pause. I stopped being impressed by men who sound reasonable about 15 years ago. Silas didn't say anything more on that subject. They came around the long curve of the South Trail, and the creek narrows appeared below them, and Silas heard Garrett make a sound not surprise, more like confirmation of what he'd been told when he saw the barricade. It was, if anything, more substantial in the morning light than it had looked the day before. Someone had added timber to it overnight, which meant Malcolm had expected this morning to require a show of permanence. On the high ground on both sides, Malcolm's men were already positioned. Those of its windows were dark. They'd heard the horses. You could hear that many horses from a considerable distance, and they were up and alert, and there were more of them than yesterday. Silas counted quickly. 14, maybe 16. Malcolm had brought reinforcements overnight. The smiling man was on the left rise, same position as before, and the smile was in place, but it had a different quality now, less certain. He was looking at the riders below and doing arithmetic that wasn't coming out the way he'd expected. Malcolm was on horseback at the base of the right rise, near the barricade. He'd positioned himself there strategically, Silas thought central, visible, in control of the narrative. He was wearing his good coat. He'd dressed for a confrontation he expected to win. He saw the federal badge on Garrett's coat from 50 yards out, and something changed in his posture. A slight adjustment. A recalculation happening behind the eyes. Then he saw the wagon. Then he saw who was on the wagon. The recalculation stopped. His face went through several things in about 2 seconds, and Silas, watching from beside Garrett, saw all of them. Shock first genuine, unperformed, the kind that hits a person before they can arrange their expression. Then something that might have been recognition, the way you recognize a thing you thought you'd left far enough behind to be safe. Then, as his mind caught up with what his eyes were telling him, a kind of controlled stillness that was more frightening than the shock, because it meant he was already moving past the surprise and toward whatever he was going to do about it. Garrett stopped his horse 20 yards from the barricade. Dark. His deputies spread out on either side of him in a line that was practiced and deliberate and communicated very clearly that this was not a group that had arrived for a conversation. Malcolm Vane, Garrett said. He had a voice that carried without effort, not loud, just clear, the kind of voice that had been used to crossing distances for a long time. I'm Marshal Thomas Garrett, Territorial Jurisdiction. I have warrants for your arrest on charges of financial fraud, theft, and unlawful conversion of assets. I'm also carrying a court order requiring the immediate removal of this barricade as an illegal obstruction of a registered water right. The silence after that was the specific silence of a situation that has become irreversible. Malcolm looked at Garrett. He looked at the 15 deputies. He looked at the barricade behind him, at his own men on the rises, at the numbers and the federal authority, and the badge catching the morning sun. Then he looked at the wagon. He looked at Lenora. And Silas, watching his face, saw the moment when the controlled stillness cracked just slightly, just at the edges, like ice when it's not quite ready to give way, but has been asked to hold more than it can. Something raw came through in that crack. Something that had been sealed up for a long time and was now being forced to the surface by the fact of her being here, alive, whole, and holding the thing he'd spent 12 years believing she couldn't reach him with. Lenora, he said, his voice had changed, not much, but enough. She didn't answer right away. The wagon had stopped at the back of the federal group, and she was sitting on the seat looking at him across 30 yards and 15 horses and 12 years of everything that had happened between them, and her face was doing its contained, careful thing, but her hands, Silas noticed, were pressed flat against her thighs in the way of someone managing something physical. Malcolm, she said. Her voice carried fine a moment. You should have stayed in Pittsburgh, he said. You should have paid your debts, she said. Malcolm turned to Garrett. The performance of reasonableness was back, but thinner now, visible as a performance in a way it usually wasn't. Marshal, whatever you've been told, I'd strongly recommend verifying the source before. I've verified the source, Garrett said. I've verified it against bank records, transfer documents, and 3 signed statements. The arrest warrant was issued by a federal judge in Cheyenne on Friday evening. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. Would you like to read it, or shall we proceed? Malcolm looked at the document. He looked at his men on the rises. Silas watched him doing the calculation. Armed men, high ground, federal authority, the specific legal weight of a warrant that had been issued by a judge rather than a local official who might be negotiated with. He was working out whether the numbers were in his favor, and the numbers were not in his favor, and he knew it, and the knowing of it was visible in the set of his shoulders. My accounts are in order, Malcolm said, whatever that document claims. Your accounts in the Caldwell Territorial Bank have been frozen pending review, Garrett said, as have accounts held under 3 other names that appear in the documentation we received. Your properties in this valley will be subject to assessment by the Federal Land Office. He said all of this the same way he said everything level, unhurried, like a man reading off a list of things that have already happened and are simply being communicated rather than decided. You can come with us peacefully, Mr. Vane, or we can have a longer morning than either of us wants. But the outcome is the same either way. Malcolm was quiet for a long moment. On the left rise, the smiling man had stopped smiling. He was looking at the federal deputies with an expression that was recalculating its position on things fairly rapidly. Silas could see it happening, the individual arithmetic of hired men who were hired for intimidation and property disputes, and now found themselves looking at a federal jurisdiction situation that nobody had mentioned when they'd agreed to the job. The smiling man looked at the man beside him. The man beside him looked at the smiling man. Something was communicated between them that required no words. Mr. Vane, the smiling man called down, and his voice had lost its performance entirely, was just a voice now, a regular voice with a regular amount of uncertainty in it. This isn't what we signed on for. Malcolm turned his head sharply. You stay where you are. Federal warrants, the smiling man said. He stopped. Started again. We were told this was a water rights dispute. It is a water rights dispute. It's a fraud arrest, Garrett said, not raising his voice. Any man who interferes with a federal arrest can expect to be included in the charges. Any man who stands down and removes himself from these situations will not be. He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. I'd give it a moment's thought. The moment's thought took about 4 seconds. On the left rise, the smiling man put up his hands not dramatically, just clearly, and took 3 steps back from his position. The man beside him did the same. Then, in the way that decisions spread through a group of men who have collectively decided that the calculation has changed, 2 more stepped back on the left, and 1 on the right, and then another, until inside of 30 seconds, there were 12 men on 2 hillsides who had made the individual decision that whatever Malcolm Vane was paying them was not, in the end, worth a federal charge. 2 men on the right rise didn't move. Garrett looked at them. His deputies looked at them. There was a particular quality to that collective regard, not threatening exactly, but very clear about what it was. Those 2 men looked at each other. Then they stepped back. Malcolm was left at the base of his barricade with the federal marshal and 15 deputies and Silas Rourke and 6 ranch hands and a wagon, and on the wagon was his half-sister, and in her bag was the thing he'd spent 12 years betting she'd never be able to assemble. He looked at Lenora again. Something moved across his face that Silas couldn't fully read. It was complicated, whatever it was, layered the way old things are layered when they've been compressed, under time and distance and deliberate forgetting. How long? He said. She understood what he was asking. 8 years to pay the debts. 4 more to find everything I needed. He stopped. Yes, she said, I have. Another silence. The creek moved on the other side of the barricade, with the sound of backed-up water heavier than running water, darker. The cattle on the lower pasture were going to need that water in a few hours. I built something real here, Malcolm said, and his voice had a quality in it that Silas hadn't expected, not quite defensive, not quite pleading, but something between the two. Something that might have been as close as this man got to genuine. Whatever I did before what I built here was real. What you built here was bought with my father's money, Lenora said. Her voice was level, but not cold. And with 8 years of my work, and with the deliberate ruin of people who trusted you. She looked at him across the distance between them. You don't get to call that real and mean something good by it. Malcolm looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Garrett. Then he looked at his own hands, resting on the saddle horn. I'd like to speak with a lawyer, he said. You're entitled to that, Garrett said. You can make arrangements in Cheyenne. He nodded to the two deputies nearest Malcolm. They moved their horses forward. Malcolm didn't run. Silas had thought he might have expected it, actually, the calculation of a man who'd always had an exit ready. But he didn't. He sat on the gray horse and let the deputies come to him. And when the older of the two reached for his arm, he pulled back just slightly, not resisting exactly, but a last reflex of a man who has spent his whole adult life not being handled. Then he let it go. He dismounted on his own, which Garrett allowed, and the deputies flanked him on both sides, and he walked still with that bearing, still with that coat toward the federal horses. He didn't look at Lenora again. She watched him go. Silas was watching her face when it happened, and what he saw there was not the satisfaction he might have expected, not triumph, not even relief, exactly. It was closer to exhaustion, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something heavy for so long that putting it down doesn't feel like freedom yet, just feels like the absence of weight, and the body hasn't decided what to do with this absence. Garrett directed his remaining deputies to assist with the barricade, and they went at it with a practicality that was efficient and entirely without ceremony. It was heavy work, the timber was substantial, the rock was real, and it took the better part of an hour with multiple men and a pair of horses applying leverage before the first section came loose. Silas worked alongside them. He wasn't built for standing and watching men work when there was work to be done, and the physical effort of it was a relief after 2 days of sitting on a hillside, performing patience he didn't entirely feel. Gentry worked beside him, and Mercer, and even Hicks, who was 53 and moved like it, but didn't suggest he should be excused. When the first section of the barricade came free, the water came through it. Not dramatically, not a wall of it, because the backup hadn't been long enough for that kind of pressure to build. Just a surge, faster and fuller than the trickle that had been finding its way around the edges, and then it spread and deepened and moved downstream, the way water moves, when it's going where it was already going, before someone put something in its way. Silas stood at the bank and watched it go. He felt Lenora come to stand beside him. She'd climbed down from the wagon at some point during the barricade work and had been talking to Garrett near the horses, and now she was here, close enough that he was aware of her without turning to look. Cattle will be all right, she said. Yes, he watched the water. Gentry, ride down to the lower pasture and get them moving toward the creek. They'll want to drink. Gentry went. The rest of the barricade came down in pieces over the next 40 minutes, and the creek ran fuller with each piece removed, and by the time the last section was pulled clear, it was running the way it was supposed to run, not a dramatic rush. Just the ordinary, reliable movement of water, doing what water does when nothing is in its way. Garrett came to find Silas when it was done. He had the bearing of a man completing a task rather than celebrating one which Silas respected. Drucker in Caldwell will be picked up by my deputy this afternoon, he said. The land assessment on Vane's properties will take some weeks, but the court order is in place. Nothing transfers, nothing sells, nothing moves until the assessment is complete. And the properties themselves? The ones bought with the stolen funds will be seized. Court will determine disposition. Garrett looked at the land around them, the creek, the pasture, the ridge. Some of it may be available for legal purchase once the assessment is done. I wouldn't know the specifics. Silas nodded slowly. He'd think about that later. Right now it was enough that the water was running. Miss Voss was thorough, Garrett said. He said it the way men of his type say things they mean seriously, but don't embellish. The documentation she brought was in 19 years. I've seen maybe 3 cases with that quality of evidence. Most fraud cases come down to he said. That ledger doesn't leave room for he said, she said. No, Silas said. It doesn't. She built that over 12 years, Garrett said. I know. Garrett looked at him. You knew she was here for a reason. I found out about a week in, and you didn't send her away. Silas thought about the night in the cookhouse, the ledger on the table between them, the moment when he could have made a different choice, when the feeling of being deceived could have been the largest thing in the room, and he could have let it be. No, he said. I didn't. Garrett nodded once, as if something had been confirmed that he'd been curious about. Then he shook Silas's hand and went to organize his deputies for the ride back. And the practical business of departure took over horses being gathered, equipment secured, the ordinary logistics of a large group of people getting ready to move. Malcolm's hired men had scattered during the barricade removal, drifting away in pairs and small groups with the quiet efficiency of men who have decided a situation is no longer relevant to them. Smiling Man was gone before the barricade was half down. Nobody had tried to stop them, because Garrett had said his piece about who would and wouldn't be included in charges, and he'd meant it, and they'd understood he meant it. The ridge above the Narrows was empty now. The high ground that had seemed so significant 2 days ago was just a ridge again. Scrub grass and rock, nobody on it, the sky above it, doing what Wyoming sky does in the morning hard blue, going on forever. Silas went to get his horse, and found Lenora already at the wagon, not sitting on the seat but standing beside it, with one hand on the sideboard, looking back toward the creek. She had the carpetbag in her other hand, the original ledger inside it, along with whatever else she'd taken to Cheyenne and brought back. She looked tired. Not the ordinary tired of a long day, the deeper kind, the tired that comes from years of effort arriving at its conclusion, and the body finally permitting itself to feel what it didn't feel while there was still work to do. You should ride in the wagon, Silas said. I'm fine. Lenora. She turned to look at him. I said, I'm fine. You've been on a train and back in 4 days. You haven't slept properly since Thursday, and you just watched your brother get arrested. He paused. Ride in the wagon. She looked at him for a moment. Most of its windows were dark. Then she climbed up onto the wagon seat, without further argument, which told him more about how tired she was than anything she'd said. He rode beside the wagon on the way back. They didn't talk much. The sun was high now, the morning's hard clarity softening into midday heat, and the ranch hands rode ahead of them in a loose group with the particular energy of men who'd been holding tension for 2 days, and were now releasing it slowly, like air from something that had been overpressured. Hicks rode back alongside Silas about halfway home. Creek's running, he said. Creek's running, Silas confirmed. Hicks was quiet for a moment. Mercer's wife is in Caldwell. He's going to want to go see her. Tell him to take a few days. Gentry's going to want to talk about his pay. He can talk to me tomorrow. And Dutch Hicks. Yeah. Can it wait until we're back at the ranch? A beat. Most of it, Hicks said, and dropped back. Silas rose of the way the rest a rel of quiet, listening to the horses and the wagon and the land, and trying to locate the feeling he'd expected to have when this was over. He'd thought it would be relief, clear and simple. Instead, it was something more complicated. Relief was in there, but it was mixed with the residue of 2 days of sustained strain, and with something that wasn't quite settled about the whole situation, some texture of unfinished business that he couldn't immediately identify. Thought about it for a while on the ride. Then he understood what it was. Crisis was resolved. The water was running. Malcolm was in federal custody. The ranch was, by any reasonable assessment, safer than it had been in 2 years. But none of that addressed the fact that the woman on the wagon beside him had arrived at Blackstone Ridge under a contract that she'd entered into for reasons that weren't what a matrimonial contract was supposed to be entered into for. She'd had her reasons. They were good reasons. He'd understood them and agreed with them and worked alongside them for 3 weeks that had changed both of them in ways that neither had entirely gotten around to discussing. Contract was still there. A piece of paper with 2 signatures on it. He didn't know what she wanted, now that the thing she'd come for was done. He realized, with a clarity that came out of nowhere and landed solidly, that he did know what he wanted. He just didn't know how to say it without making it sound like the wrong kind of thing at the wrong kind of moment. They got back to Blackstone Ridge at midday. The ranch looked the same as when they'd left it, the barn, the bunkhouse, the cookhouse, the main house with its weathered siding, and the porch that needed 2 boards replaced on the left side, a task he'd been putting off for a month. The same place it had always been. Somehow it looked different than it had 4 days ago. Or maybe he was looking at it differently. Lenora climbed down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, which was also her natural way of doing things, and walked to the cookhouse. Not escaping just going where she went, which was usually where something needed doing. He heard her moving around in there before he'd finished tying his horse. He sent the men to their various tasks, Mercer to get ready to go to Caldwell, Gentry to check on the cattle at the creek, Hicks and Stubbs to handle the afternoon feeding. The routine of it was grounding, the same way a familiar path is grounding after difficult terrain. When the yard was quiet, he went to the cookhouse. She had coffee on. She was standing at the work table with her back to him, doing something with her hands that he couldn't see, and the carpetbag was on the chair in the corner where she'd set it, and the morning light was coming through the single window at the angle it always came through at noon. "Lenora," he said, "coffee's almost ready. I don't want coffee." She turned around. Her hands were still. She looked at him with the direct, unguarded quality that she'd stopped masking around him, sometime in the last 3 weeks. And he was aware again, as he'd been aware intermittently since about day 5, and had been getting steadily more aware of, since that she was not what the matrimonial agency's careful description had prepared him for. Not in any way that the description had been wrong. Exactly. Just in all the ways it hadn't come close to cat. "What happened with Malcolm in Pittsburgh?" he said. "What he did to you. And then 8 years of paying debts that weren't yours. And then 4 more years putting that ledger together. And coming here," he paused. He was not a man who was naturally comfortable with this kind of speaking. And it showed. You could have gone anywhere. You could have taken that evidence to Cheyenne directly, without you didn't need to answer a matrimonial advertisement to do what you did. She looked at him steadily. "No. So why this way?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive thinking about how to say something true. "Because Malcolm had surrounded himself," she said. "He had money and men and legal resources. Resources and enough political relationships that walking up to a judge with a ledger wasn't going to be simple. I needed to be inside the situation. I needed someone whose interests aligned with mine and who had standing in this valley." She paused. "Your advertisement said you needed someone capable of surviving the frontier and helping rebuild a dying ranch." Something moved in her expression. "I thought I could do that. I thought it was a fair exchange." "It was," he said. "It is. But you're asking why I didn't tell you from the beginning. You told me why you didn't tell me from the beginning. You didn't know if you could trust me." "That's true. And now you do." She held his gaze. "Yes, so stop. Start it again. The reason you came here is finished. Malcolm is in custody. The ranch is safe. He made himself say the next part clearly. You could go wherever you wanted to go from here. You don't owe this place anything." She looked at him for a long time. Coffee started making its final sound on the stove, the last few burbles before it was ready, and neither of them moved. "You're asking me what I want to do," she said. "Yes. You're not telling me what you want." He looked at her. He was aware that this was the moment for a kind of honesty that didn't come naturally to him, and that the difficulty of it was not an excuse for avoiding it. "I want you to stay," he said, "not because of the contract, not because the ranch needs someone to run the kitchen, although it does." He paused. "Because of the last 3 weeks. Because of every part of them." She was very still. "That's what I want," he said. "What you want is the question." The cookhouse was quiet except for the coffee. The noon light came through the window at its angle and lay across the floor between them. Outside, somewhere down near the barn, one of the horses made a sound, and a door closed, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch going about its work continued without either of them. Lenora uncrossed her arms. She turned to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the work table where he could reach it. Then she picked up her own cup and looked at him with an expression he was only beginning to understand how to read, the one that meant she'd come to a conclusion and was deciding how to say it. "I haven't had a home in 12 years, she said. "Not a real one." She looked at the cup in her hands. "I told myself I was past needing one, that needing one was a kind of weakness I couldn't afford." She looked up. "I'm not sure I believe that anymore." He didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to something is to wait for it to finish. "I didn't come here expecting—" She started. "Stop. I didn't come here expecting you," she said. "That's the accurate version." He picked up the coffee she'd poured him. "Is that good or bad?" She looked at him across the work table with those hazel eyes that had been assessing things since the moment she stepped off the train at Caldwell, and said, "I haven't decided yet." It wasn't the answer he might have hoped for. It was, he thought, the honest one, and coming from her, he understood that the honest one was worth considerably more than the hoped-for one. "All right," he said. "I'd like to stay," she said. For now. And see, that's enough, he said. It was enough. More than enough, actually. If he was being honest with himself, which he was trying to be lately, more than had previously been his habit. He drank the coffee. It was good. It was always good when she made it, which was a small thing, and also, he was realizing, not a small thing at all. Outside, the cattle were moving toward Sweetwater Creek, and the water was running the way it was supposed to run, and Malcolm Vane was in a federal deputy's custody on the road to Cheyenne, and Blackstone Ridge, battered and short in IAS, stiffed, and with two boards needing replacement on the left side of the porch, was still standing. For now, Silas thought. For now was enough. For now lasted longer than either of them had said it would, which was the way of things that turn out to matter. The first week after Malcolm's arrest passed in the specific exhaustion that follows sustained crisis, not peaceful exactly, more like the way a body feels after a fever breaks, wrung out and tender and aware of every small discomfort it had been too occupied to notice before. The men moved slower. Conversation at the table was quieter. Even the cattle seemed to have absorbed some of it, grazing with subdued steadiness that Gentry attributed to the water situation having stressed them, and Hicks attributed to the heat, and Silas attributed to nothing in particular because he was too tired to form theories. Lenora did not slow down. This was the thing about her, that Silas was still adjusting to the way she treated the end of one set of problems as simply the beginning of the next set of problems, without apparent need for a period of recovery in between. While the men were recalibrating and the ranch was exhaling, she was already making lists. Mostestas, real lists written in her careful handwriting on the back of whatever paper was available, because she'd run out of the good paper she'd brought with her and hadn't yet gotten to Caldwell for more. He found the first list on the kitchen table 3 days after the creek. Winter provisions. She'd calculated how many months the currents would last against how many months of hard weather they typically faced. And the answer was not good, and she'd written it down in 2 columns with the gap between them made obvious. He found the second list tacked to the wall in the larder. Repairs. The roof over the bunkhouse east end, the porch boards she'd found the 2 loose ones, and apparently identified 4 more. He hadn't noticed the fence line on the northeast quarter that Hicks had been describing as adequate for 2 years, and that Lenora had walked and described as optimistic. He found the third list in his own desk, which, a moment's pause, before he remembered was shown where the ranch accounts were kept, and giving her access to review them, which had felt like a practical decision at the time, and now felt like something larger than a practical decision. The third list was financial. Income from the current cattle, projected against feed costs, repair costs, winter provisions, and wages. At the bottom, in a slight different ink that suggested she'd come back to it, was a number with a question mark beside it. The number was the approximate value of the grazing land adjacent to Blackstone Ridge's eastern boundary, the land that had been Malcolm's and was now in federal assessment. He sat with that list for a while. The federal assessment took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of letters from Cheyenne that arrived on the supply wagon and that Lenora read first because she understood the legal language better than Silas did and could translate it into plain statements about what was happening and what it meant. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of the ranch operating in a state of suspended uncertainty about what would become of the land around them, who would own it, whether the new ownership would be hostile or neutral or something else, whether the adjustment of the valley's power structure would eventually settle in their favor or produce a new set of problems they hadn't anticipated. Silas dealt with uncertainty the way he dealt with most things by working. He was up before 5 every morning and in bed late every night, and in between, he did every physical task the ranch offered, because physical tasks had the advantage of being finite in a way that uncertainty was not. You fixed the fence board, or you didn't. You moved the cattle, or you didn't. The fence board was either fixed or it wasn't, and once it was fixed, it stayed fixed, and that was more than could be said for most other things. Lenora dealt with uncertainty the way she dealt with most things, by gathering information and organizing it. She corresponded with Garrett's office twice a week. She wrote to the federal land assessor's office directly, asking questions that were polite and specific and hard to not answer because they had been phrased to not leave room for vague responses. She made contact through a letter that she wrote and rewrote 3 times at the kitchen table over 2 evenings with the lawyer who had handled her father's estate in Pittsburgh, and she received back a response that she read sitting very still at that table for about 5 minutes before she folded it up and put it in her pocket and went back to whatever she'd been doing. He didn't ask about the letter that night. He asked the next morning, after coffee, when she'd had time to settle whatever the letter had stirred up. The estate lawyer, he said. Yes. She wrapped her hands around her cup. He's been trying to find me for 2 years. There was a secondary account. My father had a personal account, separate from the company, that Malcolm either didn't know about or decided wasn't worth the effort of touching. It's been sitting in probate. She looked at the cup. It's not a large amount, $1,200. $1,200 was not a fortune. It was also not nothing. It's yours, Silas said. Half of it should have been Malcolm's, she said, under the original estate terms. Malcolm is currently facing federal fraud charges. I know. She was quiet for a moment. It feels strange. Receiving money that was always supposed to be mine and feeling like I'm taking something. You're not taking anything. You're receiving what your father left you. I know that rationally. She looked up. It doesn't always feel rational. He didn't try to fix that because it wasn't a thing that could be fixed with reassurance. It was just a true thing about the complexity of receiving what you were owed after a long time of being denied it, that it doesn't arrive cleanly, doesn't feel entirely like relief. Carries with it the weight of all the years between the owing and the receiving. What do you want to do with it, he said. She looked at him steadily. I want to invest it in the ranch. He was quiet. The roof on the bunkhouse east end needs real work before winter, she said. Not patchwork. Real work. And the winter provisions gap is significant. And if we're going to consider the eastern pasture land once the assessment is done, we'll need capital for the purchase. She paused. That's what I want to do with it. If you'll accept it. He sat with that for a moment. The offer was practical and sensible, and also not entirely practical and sensible, because $1,200 going into a ranch was a thing that bound a person to that ranch in a way that went beyond saying for now and see. He thought she probably knew that. He thought she'd thought about it. I'll accept it, he said. She nodded once, matter of fact, and went back to her coffee. But he noticed that her shoulders had dropped slightly, the way they did when something had been decided that she'd been carrying the uncertainty of. And he thought that this was Lenora Voss's version of relief, not something you'd see if you didn't know what to look for. He was starting to know what to look for. The assessment concluded on a Thursday in late August, 6 weeks after Malcolm's arrest, on a day hot enough that the air above the lower pasture shimmered and the cattle stood in the creek shade and didn't move much, and the men worked slowly and drank more water than usual. The letter from the federal land office arrived on Abe's afternoon wagon. Lenora brought it to the kitchen table. And opened it with the letter knife she'd started keeping by the mail pile, another small habit she'd installed without discussion that had become so natural he no longer noticed it, except when it wasn't there. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and turned it so he could read it. He read it. Malcolm's properties had been assessed and valued. Those purchased with documented stolen funds, which included the eastern grazing land, the Caldwell warehouse operation, and 2 parcels on the North Ridge, were to be liquidated by federal order with proceeds applied against restitution. Properties were being offered for legal purchase to interested parties. There was a figure beside the eastern grazing land. Silas looked at the figure for a long moment. With the $1,200 Lenora was putting in, and with the credit he had at the Caldwell Bank, which had been restored when the story of Malcolm's arrest had become known, because the bank had its own complicated history with Malcolm Vane's finances, and was suddenly very interested in being on the right side of things, they could make the purchase. Not comfortably, with very little room for anything to go wrong. But they could do it. It's a lot of land, Lenora said. It is, and a significant debt if the winter is bad. It would be. She looked at him. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm listing the risks. I know you are. He looked at the letter again. The eastern pasture is good grazing, better than most of what I have now, and the water access from that side would mean we're not dependent on Sweetwater Creek as the only source. He paused. That dependency is what gave Malcolm his leverage. She nodded slowly. We buy it, he said. It came out more simply than he'd expected it to. She looked at the figure on the letter, then at him. All right, she said. They submitted the purchase offer the next morning. It was accepted 2 weeks later. And on a cool September morning, Silas Rourke signed the papers that extended Blackstone Ridge's eastern Ogeechobee by a third again its previous size and changed the shape of the ranch's future in ways they were both still working out. He signed them at the Caldwell Land Office desk. Lenora stood beside him. The land office clerk, a young man who clearly knew the story from the way he was trying not to stare at either of them, slid the papers across the desk and said nothing beyond what was required. Outside in the Caldwell Street, the September air had the first edge of autumn in it, not cold yet, but changed from summer, carrying the particular quality of a season getting ready to turn. That's a lot of ranch, Lenora said. Yes, we're going to need more hands. I know. And the bunkhouse situation, Lenora. She looked at him. For 1 minute, he said, can we just, he gestured vaguely at the street, the air, the morning, before the next list. She looked at him for a moment. With that expression, the one that had started as unreadable and was now legible to him as a kind of contained amusement that she wasn't quite willing to let be fully visible. 1 minute, she said. They stood in the Caldwell Street for something close to 1 minute in the September morning. It wasn't peaceful. Exactly, there was wagon noise and someone shouting across the street about a delivery and a dog that was having opinions about something near the feed store. But it was ordinary noise, not the noise of a crisis. Just the noise of a town going about its business. On a Thursday morning, he thought about the winter coming, the bunkhouse roof, the new pasture, and what it would take to fence it properly. Provisions gap that still needed addressing. 2 men he'd need to hire before November, minimum. He thought about Lenora standing beside him in the Caldwell Land Office while he signed the papers that neither of them could have signed alone. He thought about a matrimonial contract that was still technically in the desk at the main house. All right, she said. Minute's up. One more thing, he said. She waited. When we get back, he said, tonight, I want to talk about the contract. Something shifted in her face. Not most of its windows were kind of attention, a sharpening of whatever she'd already been paying attention to. The marriage contract. Yes, what about it? He looked at the street. I haven't handled that conversation the way I should have. I've been thinking about what I want to say for a few weeks and not saying it because I couldn't find the right. He stopped. I'll find it tonight. I just wanted you to know it's coming. She looked at him steadily. All right, she said, and her voice had a quality in it he recognized from 3 weeks ago in the cookhouse when she'd said, I'd like to stay. Like a door that had been almost closed and had just opened another inch. They walked to the wagon. The ride back from Caldwell took 2 hours, and he spent most of it thinking about what he was going to say and how he was going to say it, which was the wrong approach, but the only one available to him, because he was not a man who had ever been good at this kind of thing. He'd been better at it once, maybe. Before the ranch started failing. Before 2 years of grinding difficulty had made him compress everything that wasn't essential into the smallest possible space so that the essential things could survive. What he wanted to say was this, that he had started the matrimonial contract as a transaction, and that somewhere between the first evening and the ledger on the kitchen table and to Cheyenne, and he'd stood in the Barntines telling his 6 remaining men. To hold, he had stopped being the person who had signed a transaction and had become someone different. Someone who had a reason to be careful that didn't show up in ranch ledgers. Someone's of its windows were dark. Someone who thought about a light under a door at 3 a.m. and what it meant that it made him feel less alone. He didn't know how to say all of that without it sounding like something from a dime novel. He was going to have to find a version of it that sounded like himself, and that was the difficulty. By the time they pulled into the Blackstone Ridge yard in the late afternoon, he still didn't have the version that sounded like himself. Supser that evening was the same as most supser had become over the past 6 weeks, not remarkable, which was itself remarkable compared to what the table had been before. Hicks and Gentry and Mercer ate and talked about the cattle situation on the new eastern pasture, what fencing would be needed, and when, and Stubbs, who had been quiet for most of the past month, said something that made Gentry laugh. And the sound of it in the kitchen was easy and natural in a way that Silas hadn't heard in a long time. He sat, were dark. He sat at the head of the table and ate his supper and thought about how a table could be a different thing than it used to be. And the difference was not furniture. After supper, the men went to the bunkhouse, which was their habit, and the kitchen emptied in the way it did every evening, a gradual retreat. Dishes stacked, chairs pushed in, the particular quiet of a place that has been full of people and then isn't. Lenora was at the stove, banking the fire for the night. Her back was to him. He was at the table with his coffee and the folded papers from the land office that he'd put in his jacket pocket that morning and not yet moved anywhere else. He got up and went to the desk in the adjoining room and found the matrimonial contract in the second drawer where it had been since the day he'd put it there after she arrived. He stood looking at it for a moment. 2 pages. 2 signatures. Transaction entered into by 2 people for specific reasons that had since been superseded by everything that had happened since. He brought it back to the kitchen. Lenora had turned from the stove. She saw what he was holding, and her hands stilled at her sides. He set the contract on the table. "I've been trying to figure out what to say about this for 3 weeks," he said. "I haven't gotten to anything brilliant." "I don't need brilliant," she said. "I know." He looked at the contract. "What I have is this. You came here for reasons that were yours, and they were good reasons, and I don't fault them. And I came into this marriage for reasons that were mine, and they made sense at the time." He paused. "Neither of us signed this the way people are supposed to sign something like this." "No," she said, "we didn't." "So it's not," he stopped again. "It doesn't feel like the right foundation for what we've actually been doing." She was very still. "What have we actually been doing?" He looked at her directly, because the thing about Lenora Voss was that she didn't accept sideways answers, and he'd known that since about day 4, and trying to give her one now would be an insult to everything he'd learned about who she was. "Building something," he said, "together. That neither of us built alone." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, somewhere far down the pasture, one of the cattle made a sound that carried in the evening air and then was gone. "Contract says you're here because you signed a paper," he said. "I don't want you here because you signed a paper." He picked it up. "I want you here because you choose to be. Because you looked at this ranch and this life and decided this is where you want to be. Not because of Malcolm, not because of the transaction, because of what this place is and what it's becoming." He paused. "And if that's not what this is for you, I need to know that. Now, while there's still time, too, while we can still be honest about it." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he started to be aware of his own heartbeat in a way that was uncomfortable. "You know what I find difficult about you," she said. He hadn't expected that. "No. You say the right thing," she said. "And then you look surprised that it was the right thing, like you were expecting to fail at it." Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. "You've been doing that since the first week." He didn't know what to say to that. She crossed the kitchen and put her hand over his, the hand holding the contract, not taking it, just covering it with her palm. He felt the warmth of it with a clarity that came from it being unexpected and also from it being the first time she'd initiated something like this voluntarily, without it being functional or purposeful, without it being in service of anything except the thing it was. "I'm here because I choose to be," she said. "For the record." He held her gaze. "For the record," he said. He tore the contract in half, then in half again. He put the pieces on the table and left them there, which was perhaps not the tidiest resolution. But neither of them moved to do anything about it for a long while. The winter came in November, as Wyoming winters do not gradually, not apologetically, but as a fact. Most of its windows were dark. The temperature dropped in a week from something manageable to something that required every preparation they'd made and a few they hadn't thought of. The bunkhouse roof held. The roof repair had been done in October, 2 weeks of work by the 2 new hands they'd hired, a man named Briggs, no relation to Malcolm's watcher, and a younger man called Tom, who was 19 and worked like he had something to prove, and it held through the first 3 storms of the season without a leak, which Lenora received as confirmation of her structural assessment, the way a person receives confirmation of a thing they were fairly sure about, but needed verified. The winter provisions were sufficient. Not lavishly, there were weeks in January when the menu was less varied than anyone would have preferred, and one storm in February kept them housebound for 9 days and tested everyone's patience, including Silas, but sufficient. Nothing went short that mattered. The cattle came through in better shape than the previous 2 winters combined. Some of the credit was the new eastern pasture, which had better shelter from the north wind than the old range. Some of it was the water access from the second source that Lenora had argued for when they were looking at the purchase, which meant the animals had reliable water even when Sweetwater Creek ran slower under ice. And some of it was a change in how the herd was managed. Through cold months, a system Lenora had proposed in October, based on something she'd read about in an agricultural publication she'd sent away from Pittsburgh, its windows, which Gentry had received with skepticism and implemented with grudging competence, and which had worked better than the old method by a margin that was visible in the spring count. Gentry did not admit this directly, but he started implementing the second system she proposed without requiring convincing, which was its own kind of admission. The spring count was the highest Blackstone Ridge had recorded in 4 years. Silas is in the barn. Silas was in when Hicks came to tell him the number, and he stood with it for a moment before saying anything. He looked at the barn walls, at the horses in their stalls, at the thin spring light coming through the gaps, where 2 boards had warped and needed replacement. There was always something that needed replacement. That was the nature of a ranch. It was an ongoing argument with entropy, and you were never definitively winning, just currently ahead. Tell her, he said. Hicks looked at him. Tell Lenora first, he said. She'll want to know. Hicks nodded, and there was something in his expression that he didn't say and didn't need to. By the second spring, Blackstone Ridge had become difficult to recognize as the operation it had been 18 months earlier. Not because it was unrecognizable in its physical facts, the same house, the same barn, the same creek running through the same narrows, but because the operation of it had changed in ways that had accumulated quietly, the way improvements accumulate when they're made by people who understand systems rather than just solving immediate problems. Kitchen ran on a schedule that maximized what the provisions could provide across a week rather than treating each meal as isolated. The accounts were maintained in a ledger that was updated weekly and that Silas now understood without needing translation, because Lenora had spent 3 months teaching him accounting with the same direct efficiency she applied to everything, and he had been a stubborn student at first, and then an increasingly capable one. The ranch hands understood their roles and their expectations, and the consequences for falling short of them, because Lenora had established clarity around those things in her first month at the ranch and maintained it without drama. And there was something else that was harder to put numbers to. Quality of the place. Not the buildings or the land, the feel of it, the thing that visitors noticed before they could identify what they were noticing. That it was a place where people were cared for adequately and expected to work seriously and treated like adults who had chosen to be there. That was Lenora's doing. Not through any single dramatic act, not through the first supper, though the first supper mattered, but through 300 small, consistent acts repeated over 18 months until they had become the way the place worked. A cattleman named Aldridge from the next valley came to discuss the possibility of a shared grazing arrangement in late April of the second spring, and spent an hour in the kitchen drinking coffee while the conversation happened, and on his way out he told Silas quietly and with the particular approval of an older man who has seen enough ranches to know the difference, that he hadn't seen an operation this well run in 10 years. Silas had said thank you. He'd thought about the words all the way back to the barn. The thing about the men who had mocked Lenora on the platform at Caldwell was that most of them were still at the ranch. Gentry, Stubbs, even Hicks, who hadn't mocked her exactly, but had watched with the neutrality of a man waiting to see if she'd last. They didn't talk about the platform at Caldwell. That was not the kind of thing men in this situation discussed directly. But something had changed in how they were with her, and it hadn't changed in a single moment. It had changed the way the ranch changed, through accumulation, through small, consistent things adding up over time. Gentry was the one who made it most visible, which was ironic because he'd been the most skeptical. He started deferring to her on supply questions in the second month. He started asking her opinion on cattle management questions in the 4th month, which was something he'd asked Silas's opinion on because Gentry considered himself the authority on cattle, and he wasn't entirely wrong. By the time spring came around for the second time, he had developed the habit of stopping by the kitchen with any problem that didn't have an obvious answer, not because he needed her to solve it, but because he'd learned that talking it through with her usually clarified it. He would never have described this as respecting her. of its windows were dark, he would have described it as being practical. But the distinction was smaller than he thought it was. Mercer, who had a wife and child in Caldwell, brought his family to the ranch for a Sunday dinner in March of the second year. His wife was a quiet woman named Clara, who looked at the operation and at Lenora with the particular alertness of a woman assessing whether this is a safe place to bring her child. She stayed for 5 hours and helped with the afternoon kitchen work, and left having said to her husband on the wagon home something that Silas heard from Sir secondhand, with the awkward transmission of something not entirely meant to be repeated, that she'd finally stopped worrying about him. Tom, the 19-year-old who worked like he had something to prove, had apparently decided that whatever he was proving it here because he turned down offer from a larger outfit in October and said nothing about it to anyone and just kept showing up every morning at the same time. Hicks, in the way of Hicks, said the least and meant the most. He said it one evening in late autumn, sitting on the porch after supper, his one concession to leisure, the 20 minutes after the evening meal when he sat in the same chair and looked at the same view and didn't do anything. When Silas came out and sat in the other chair, they sat in silence for a while. The sky was doing the October thing it did in Wyoming, going colors that seemed excessive, and the air had the edge of coming cold. She changed this place, Hicks said. Yes, Silas said. Not just the kitchen. I know. Hicks was quiet for another minute. Your mother would have liked her. Silas looked at the sky. His mother had been a woman who built things out of what was available and didn't wait for conditions to be ideal, and never once pretended the work was easy. He thought about that. Yeah, he said. She would. Malcolm's trial was in Cheyenne in November of the first year. Neither Silas nor Lenora attended. Garrett had told them their presence wasn't required, the evidence was sufficient. The case was not going to hinge on testimony, and they had a ranch to run and a winter to prepare for. The verdict came in a letter that arrived on a Thursday. Convicted on 3 counts. 7 years. Lenora read the letter at the kitchen table, with her coffee going cold beside her. When she finished, she folded it carefully and set it on the table and sat for a moment looking at the wall. Silas, who had been at the window when she opened it and had watched her read, didn't say anything. He waited. 7 years, she said. He'll be 50 when he gets out. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. I've been angry at him for 12 years, she said. I thought when this happened I'd feel I don't know. Clear, she looked at the letter. I just feel tired. He sat down across from her. That's not the wrong thing to feel. It's not what I expected. Most things that feel like justice don't feel the way you expected when they arrive, he said. It came from somewhere that had its own experience of things, not arriving the way you'd pictured them. She looked at him. Is that supposed to be comforting? Just true. She held his gaze for a moment. Then something shifted, not quite a smile, but in that territory. It is true, she said. She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She got up and poured it out and made fresh, and while she was at the stove and while she was at were doing the thing they did when she was processing something slightly raised, slightly forward, and then a deliberate release. By the time she came back to the table with 2 fresh cups, the tension had gone from her posture. Not because the 12 years had been resolved. Not because anger disappears when the thing it was aimed at has been addressed, because it doesn't work like that, and anyone who tells you it does hasn't had occasion to carry something for 12 years. But because a woman who had been moving toward a fixed point for a very long time had finally reached it, and now the landscape in front of her was open, and open was different from obstructed, and different took time to know what to do with. What do you want to do today? Silas said. She looked at him. After coffee, he said, What do you want to do? She thought about it. The winter records need to be started, and I want to look at the north fence line on the east pasture before the ground freezes. That's not what I asked. She looked at him more carefully. What did you ask? I asked what you want to do. She was quiet for a moment. The question was unusual from him. He was not a man who typically separated want from should, and they both knew it. He was working on it. That was the accurate description. They were both working on things, separately and together, and the working on them was imperfect and slow, and occasionally involved saying the wrong thing and having to come back to it. I want to ride the eastern pasture, she said. Not to check the fence, just to ride it. All right, he said. You'll come? Come. They rode out after coffee in the late morning, the 2 of them, No specific task, just the new pasture and the autumn light and the knowledge that this land was theirs in the legal sense and in the other sense. And in the other sense, the one that comes from having fought for a thing and kept it and built it into something that could last. Talk much. They didn't need to. That was also something that had happened gradually, the way the good things happened, the comfort of two people who had learned each other's silences well enough to tell the productive ones from the difficult ones and could leave each other in the productive ones without anxiety. The land was good. It was genuinely good, better than Silas had known when he was looking at it from the outside, and he'd known it was good then. The grass held moisture longer than the old pasture. The tree breaks were natural and sufficient. There was a rise on the northeast corner that Lenora had identified in October as a good position for a secondary water trough fed from the creek that ran through the upper section, and she was right, and they were going to build it in the spring. She pulled up at the top of the northeast rise and looked back across the whole sweep of it, the new pasture, and beyond it the original Blackstone Ridge range, and the buildings small in the distance, and the creek. Silas stopped his horse beside her. "This is a good ranch," she said. "Not what it would be. Not what it could be. What it was right now, on a November morning with the winter coming." "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked at it for a moment longer. He watched her face and thought about a platform at a train station and a battered carpetbag and hazel eyes that had been assessing things from the first second and had not, as far as he'd ever been able to tell, been wrong about what they assessed. She had not come here for him. He understood that and had never required it to be otherwise. She had come here for her own reasons, good and serious reasons, and the fact that the reasons had eventually opened into something larger was not something either of them had planned or managed or been strategic about. It had just happened, the way things happen when two people who are both serious about the same piece of ground spend enough time on it together. There was a thing he'd been meaning to say for several weeks and had been finding reasons to delay, because finding reasons to delay was one of his established habits that he was working on with moderate success. "Lenora," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know what? Whatever you're about to say." She was still looking at the land. "I've been waiting for you to say it for about 3 weeks. How long have you known I was going to say it?" She turned to look at him. The thing that was usually not quite a smile was this time a smile. "Since August," she said. He thought about August. The land office. The Caldwell Street. The way she'd said 1 minute's up and he'd said one more thing. "That's a long time to wait," he said. "You do things in your own time," she said. "I've adjusted." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, the same hand she'd put over his in the kitchen the night he tore up the contract, and she let him hold it, her fingers curling around his with the ease of something practiced, even though it wasn't practiced, just felt like it should be. "I'm not going to be easy to be married to," he said. "I've been living alone too long. I have habits. I know your habits. I work too early and too late, and I don't talk about things when I should, and I've been wrong about enough things in the last 2 years that I should probably be more humble than I am." "All true," she said, "and I know what I am," she said. "I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those direct, clear eyes, and he thought about the woman who had stood on that platform with a battered carpetbag and told him, "Give me something worth saving." Most of its windows were dark, and about the woman who had copied a ledger by lamplight for 3 nights without telling him, and about the woman who had sat on a wagon seat beside Abe on a Sunday morning and come back with a federal marshal, and about the woman sitting across from him at breakfast, and across from him at supper, and sometimes across from him at 3 in the morning when neither of them could sleep, and the kitchen was the only lit room in the house. He thought about what it meant that this was the same woman, that all of those things lived in the same person. "I'd like to do this properly," he said. "If you're willing, a real marriage, in Caldwell with whatever formalities are required." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass on the northeast rise, and the horses shifted their weight, and the distance between them on horseback was the specific distance of two people who were not yet touching, but were about to. "I'm willing," she said. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was Lenora Voss's version of one, which was to say something true and mean it completely and not dress it up in anything it didn't need. He held her hand on the northeast rise of the eastern pasture of Blackstone Ridge, on a November morning, and the winter coming, and the spring after that, and all the ordinary difficult work of a life, together stretching out in front of them like the land not easy, not certain, not without cost, but genuine and theirs. That was the thing, in the end, that neither the matrimonial contract nor any careful plan had managed to account for. That two people could come together for practical reasons and complicated reasons and not entirely honest reasons, and still, through the work of it and the time of it and the particular education of surviving something hard together, arrive at something real. Not perfect. Real was better than perfect. Perfect was a thing you aimed at and adjusted away from when the actual conditions made themselves known. Real was what remained after the adjusting, and it held weight, and it held weather, and it could be built on. Lenora Voss had come west to fight her own battle. She had not expected to find a ranch worth fighting for alongside one. She had not expected to find a man who, after enough time and difficulty and honesty, was worth choosing. But the land had surprised her, and the ranch had surprised her. And Silas Rourke, who was stubborn and imperfect and too slow to say the things he meant, and too proud and too decent in the ways that mattered, he had surprised her most of all. She chose him anyway, because that was what you did with a good surprise. You held on to it,